Hey, welcome to everyone in the room. I'm seeing a lot of comments already in the chat, which is great to see. Love to see people participating. So I think we'll go ahead and start. Before we go ahead and move forward, let me go ahead and explain. We'll have question and answer for the last half of this session. So if something comes to mind and you have a question, if you would please hold the question till the end of the session, because you'll have an opportunity to ask at that time. My name is Briella Diaz. I'm the coordinator of the Deaf Mentor Program at the Tennessee School for the Deaf. We're thrilled to have our special guest here with us tonight. Her name is Karen Putz. I'll let Karen say a few things about herself, why she's here with us tonight. So go ahead, Karen.
Hello, everyone. It's a real honor for me to be here tonight. I'm excited about going through this process with all of you here in Tennessee. You know, Nashville is like a second home. I have a family in Nashville, so I go to Nashville very often to visit family. Like she said, my name is Karen Putz, and my last name really is Putz. I married a man named Putz, but he's a nice one. And really, I mean, it's a good last name. To become Putz, I mean, it is what it is. We just have to go with it. I'm a mom. I have 3 deaf, hard of hearing adult children. They were born hearing. The first one became deaf. The second is hard of hearing, and the third one became deaf as they grew up. My husband is deaf as well. And our dog has become deaf as he's gotten older. He's lost his hearing. So we're just a whole happy family. My brothers and sisters are deaf or hard of hearing as well. My mom is deaf and my grandmother was deaf. So it's generational in our family. My story is that I was born being able to hear with some hearing loss, but then as I grew older, I became deaf.
At 19.
When I was 19 years old, I lost my hearing while I was skiing, water skiing. I fell while I was water skiing, and that is how I lost my hearing, just instantaneously. Yeah.
Boy, out of the blue, Karen.
So, I mean, I didn't grow up using sign language. I grew up mainstreamed and speaking for myself. So after I became deaf, I really woke up to the realization that it was time for me to learn ASL. And I picked it up. I've been picking it up ever since.
So are you still using spoken English to this day, and you go between the 2 languages?
Yes. In the mornings I work on a horse farm, and all of the other people who work there are hearing, and so I speak with them, but they've been learning sign language, and so as we've gotten to know each other, then that's been really good. But I just match kind of whoever it is that I'm with. And I've been a deaf mentor now for about 20 years in the early deaf mentorship program and training
Ski.
SKI, or do you say it's ski? Okay. Ski.
Sky High.
Got it. Sky High. Thank you. So I've been working with that program for about 15 years now, but it's been going on for about a total of 20 years. And my family just recently moved to New York. So
Let me take it, Lydia.
Yeah.
So I lived in New York, and so I worked in the early intervention system in New York. So it was a little bit different than it is here in Nashville. So I worked for Hands and Voices as the co-director of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and it was an infusion program. And my work there was to connect families that have deaf and hard of hearing children with deaf and hard of hearing adults. So tonight's topic is absolutely positively perfect. And Lydia, take Briella.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to hearing more of your perspective about it. I think it's really important that we have deaf role models. And I want to discuss that importance. So you said that you were born and grew up being able to hear and speak.
Well, I was hearing and then became hard of hearing in elementary school. And I was hard of hearing until 19 years old.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I see. So you weren't really part of the deaf community growing up.
No, I had never met a deaf kid until I got into high school.
So did you meet deaf adults in high school, or you met other deaf high schoolers?
One hard of hearing kid, and we were put in the same place, which is unfortunate because on the next street over, there was a deaf girl. We were the same age, and we were never introduced to each other because she signed and I did not. And people thought, why bother? Why make the connection? And you know what? But we're friends today. So, you know, looking back at that experience, the idea of separating or separate communication, that has to stop. That really needs to stop. You know, we're losing opportunities. If we separate people based on modes of communication, we're missing opportunities to expand our horizons. You know, my world before I became a deaf person was quite small, but after I became deaf, it expanded significantly. And the reason is because deaf and hard of hearing role models, deaf community, deaf and hard of hearing people are everywhere.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. And I have a question. So what if the parents are not ready to meet deaf adults? Because we know that a lot of parents aren't expecting to have a deaf child. That takes them by surprise. And it's a process for them to adjust and to really accept their child's deafness. And that happens for a lot of deaf children.
And embrace the joy that comes with it.
Yes, to embrace the joy that their child brings. So we know that that's a process. So what if those parents aren't ready to meet deaf adults? What are your thoughts on that, Karen?
Well, first of all, you know, they weren't ready to meet their baby. So it's the same concept. When I first started working as a deaf mentor, I was the last choice, you know, the in early intervention system. They had already met a plethora of professionals, you know, and then, you know, they brought me in if the family was interested in. And we have to stop that way of doing things because it's not the right model. First of all, families are never ready, period, end of story. The best perspective to have, however, is a normalized, is to make deaf people normalized. We are part of the system from the day one, you know, from moment one to be exact. When a family member meets a deaf person, yes, it's a process, but it's part of healing for them. You know, and we see it over and over and over again when a family meets a deaf or hard of hearing person, the process is quicker and they experience that joy quicker. Let me give you just a quick example. The first job I had after college graduation, I was working at an independent living center. And I met with families of young children that really didn't have any other options. And they were just ready to quit. I mean, that was their first baby oftentimes. And so gut instinct at with a 6-month-old baby, for the interpreter, clarify, 6-month-old baby, what happened? So the families with the 6-month-old baby, a mother with a 6-month-old, that was my client. And she called me. And so, I was on my way home, but I never really quit my job. I met with that client. Okay. So again, 6-month-old baby, I had a 6-month-old baby and we made a connection. So the mother was like, she had a deaf child and she had the most questions I'd ever seen, but we bonded immediately and became best friends. And our children grew up together. And that mom became an interpreter and a speech therapist. But my point of this story is, one day she asked me questions. And, parents are grieving. But some do and some don't. But a lot of this mother in particular, one day was enough. Once she got through that, she skyrocketed. And, she gave her child everything, sign language, English, you name it, everything. So her child still signs and grew up signing, but she's in the hearing world 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So the concept of a deaf mentor and matching with the families. So a family with a child that uses spoken English doesn't necessarily need to meet someone who's signing. That is the common concept anyways, to keep those separate because their communication modes are different. But the reason I think that whole thing needs to stop is because a baby, we don't know what their future looks like. We don't know. We do not know the capabilities of that child and what their choices are going to be in the future. Secondly, we need to expand the parents' minds about their child. Meeting a deaf person in real life, someone that signs, they might think, oh, that's not necessary. But when a parent actually meets a deaf person and they're like, oh, okay, so you're deaf, but you don't speak. Well, how do you Google? It expands their mind and their ability. Everything's expanded. We need that model. So if you ask me another question, I can go on.
Yeah, I often think that parents don't know what deaf adults look like. So when they're able to meet a deaf adult, then those old concepts about what deaf adults might look like, it expands. They get a different perspective. They can put a face to what's going on. And I think that that's one way. There's no one way to deafness. So when parents meet many different deaf people, different kinds of deaf people, then they go, oh, wow, okay, and their perspective is widened at that point. So what if a local family here in Tennessee, we've got a lot of families that live in the rural areas and farmland. What if they don't have any deaf adults in their local area? Or, maybe they have to travel quite a ways in order to get to an area that has more deaf adults. How do they go about meeting deaf adults in that situation?
Well, that is a good question. There's a couple of things that come to mind. I remember when my kids were little, there was one situation where my daughter came friends with another girl that lived almost an hour away from us. And her mom and I would drive and meet halfway. We would grab one kid, come back to one of our houses, and then swap and do it. We did this for years and years and years. Also, my kids were very involved in theater, deaf theater, of course. So that's over an hour away too. And we did that for 10 years, driving back and forth and back and forth. And to this day, I mean, that's one of their fondest memories. Now, 4 hours to Michigan just to get involved in a workshop, but my kids would get on a plane to go to deaf camp. And my point for this is parents have to be creative, figure out and find opportunities. For example, pizza night. We do that all the time. We invite families over to the house.
Mm-hmm.
We send out a flyer through the school, word of mouth. We have through the Hands and Voices chapter that I founded, I send it out that way. I have to be creative. I use Zoom, which is fantastic. I love Zoom. It's like my favorite thing. I mean, I never call people unless I Zoom them. The captions are there. It's just great. So parents today, my goodness, you have resources there. Be creative, be assertive, invite other families. It doesn't matter if they're different from you. Invite them to come on in. We did some kickball picnics. And my kids, I mean, they were like, oh my gosh, Mom, stop it with the kickball picnics. But now they look back and they're thinking, listen, they didn't grow up like the average family because we did all this stuff.
I really like that concept of trying your best to meet different families and find that connection and developing those relationships. It's great. And I was just thinking about connections and developing community as well. I mean, I'm really happy that you mentioned that because that's the kind of thing that we like to do here.
Well, and so there's another thing that was also rather helpful. We were involved in the school as CODA interpreters at the school. So they signed, they signed music. Okay.
Hold on, I want to interrupt you for just a second for clarification because some people might not know what the word CODA means.
Oh, right. Okay, of course. Children of deaf adults. So the interpreter at school, her parents are deaf. So the interpreter was a CODA. So, deaf culture was brought into the hearing world in the school. And they would sign all of the songs. Every year the music teacher would make sure to include sign language, at least one song. The principal, boy, all the way on board. He would have Deaf Culture Week. And I mean, the creativity of the things that we did was great. The school was a comfortable place. The community was a comfortable place for my kids. Yeah.
So when you say in the school, and you're talking about the family, that was in Illinois, because that's where your family was, right? So in the school there, was there a school for the deaf, or are you talking about public school?
Yeah. Okay. So my oldest one went to deaf school and then mainstreamed into the public school. We were kind of like, oh, I don't know about that, but we got on board and it turned out beautifully. So that's what happened to all three of them. So when they got to high school, they went back to the deaf school and, excuse me, they were in deaf school and mainstreamed at the same time. My daughter went to a hearing public school in the morning and then to the deaf school in the afternoon. So she did both. My boys, however, the deaf school had like 100 deaf students at the school in the deaf program. So the three.
So in public school, there was a deaf program within the public school system.
Right, exactly. So they all went to RIT and NTID.
So that concept that RIT has, where there's like this large university for students who are hearing, and yet they have the smaller, say, college within the university for the deaf students. I
Right,
think
deaf
that's
and hard of hearing.
wonderful. I think it's good for families to know about that. I don't know how often people hear about Gallaudet, but that is a college for deaf students. But then there's also RIT as well, that has the college for the deaf within the larger public university. So you mentioned a little bit, and I just want to go back and ask again about your family. So when you were a child, you spoke English and you picked that up pretty easily. In general, so not specifically you, Karen, but in general, children who grow up using their voice and speaking English, their parents may not feel a need to have their child meet other deaf children and learn sign language in order to communicate. So they might even think, what's the point of learning sign language? Karen, what is your perspective? Let me go back. I don't mean what's the point of learning ASL, but if you have two kids.
What's the point of putting them together in the same space if they can't communicate because they use two different languages?
Yeah, let me voice for now. So what's the point of having two deaf kids interact if one uses spoken English and the other uses ASL, and they can't communicate? So what's the point of having them interact? So that's my question. So can you expand on that?
Well, you know what? Kids figure things out. They do. They really do. So you asked me, what's the point? The point is to expand their horizons and expand their social group. If a child speaks English, that's great. That's a great skill to have. And they might pick up ASL. That's a great skill to have also. They might pick up cute speech. That is another fantastic skill to have. But we kind of think in boxes. We think limited. We think limited. So I'm hoping that the perspective will change. It's not necessarily about the communication per se. It's about the individual. So that the more kids socialize with each other, the more they figure it out. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, I have more questions, but I think I'm going to hold off on that for now, and I'm going to give time to transfer to the Q&A part of this event tonight.
Well, before we transition, there was one thing I did want to share, please. I was thinking about the value of deaf and hard of hearing role models.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So what is the value? For me, I grew up without any role models. The only role model was Helen Keller. That's it. The only deaf person that I heard of, and it was on a movie. My kids grew up in a whole different world. I mean, I didn't like cram it down their throat. I mean, you know, but they were like, Mom. And so why did I expose them to so much? Because we just don't know the abilities of a person until we see somebody else doing something. So let me give you an example. I took all kind of parenting classes, parenting meetings. Sorry. I hosted, thank you, many parent meetings. And parents would come in and ask me all the questions under the sun. One mom stood up and she said, last night, my son told me, Mom, I want to become a fireman. And the mom's voice, you know, she stuttered and she started crying. Inside, I knew he couldn't. And she just bawled her eyes out over this. And I told her, well, why not? And the mom looked at me like I had 3 heads. And she said, well, you have to be hearing and you have to be able to speak to be a fireman, right? And I said, well, just an FYI for you. I have news for you. That mom lived 2 towns over from a fire department that had a full-time firefighter that was deaf and knew sign language, but did not speak English. And the mom's jaw hit the floor. And my friend Neil out east, he is a volunteer firefighter and he is deaf also. And in Pennsylvania, there is a full-time firefighter chief that is deaf. So why can't your son be a firefighter? And the mom's face lit up. And now she went home and told her son, oh my gosh, with confidence, she told him, you can be a firefighter. That is a valuable role model. And how many of you can Google? How many of you use Google today?
Oh yeah, I do.
Hands going up across the room, I'm sure. How many of you know that Google and the internet was developed by a deaf man?
I didn't know that.
Billions of people use the internet every single day. And a deaf man was on the team. And he's called, yes, there's the gold star for Connie, Vincent Olaf. He was part, yes. Then, oh good Lord, help the interpreter.
Vincent Cerf.
Vincent Cerf, thank you. He was on the team that helped develop the internet, and he's called the father of the internet. So there you go. And that is my point. There is value. So, wow. Hey, let's open the Q&A.
Yes. Oh, I'm so happy that you threw that in there. That's very inspiring. Wow. Okay, so now we're going to open the floor for questions. For those of you who are new, that this is maybe your first time with us, when I open it to questions, I would like to allow the parents to go first. And then when the parents are done asking their questions, then I'll go ahead and open the floor to the professionals in the meeting. Are there any parents or family members who have questions this evening? If so, please type your question in the chat box. Or if you prefer to sign, then to ask in English, then we'll.
Hey, don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Someone typing. Okay, are you guys still thinking about your questions? We can take one professional question for the time being. Okay, I do have one question here in the chat box from Angeli. She asks, what is the best way to teach my older deaf kids ASL?
Well, that's a good question. There are many opportunities online. Just YouTube is one example. You can sit down and watch YouTube together on the TV, cast from your laptop to the TV, and you could do that, or you could sign up for sign language classes online. But I'm sure Briella, has Tennessee resources for you. I mean, a laundry list from deaf mentors to programs to teachers.
Oh, let me clarify. So the older kids are hearing and the youngest is deaf. And so you want to teach your older kids ASL. And
yeah, exactly. So what often happens when I'm working with a family, we work at night together, so they can watch they watch TV together and they can practice together. So also there's silent dinners. Those are great. Once a week, maybe every Friday night, for example. Supper on Friday night, everyone has to use sign language together. And you can involve the deaf community if you want, because they sign in and go to events within the community.
Thank you for that answer. Are there any other questions? Any other thoughts, comments? Again, go ahead and type it in the chat box. Okay, I have one from Amina. She says, I am a healthcare professional, and I am curious about poor interaction that you had with a healthcare professional that stands out to you, as well as one that sticks out to you in a very positive way.
That's a tough one. When I was pregnant with my first baby and I requested an interpreter, boy, was that a fight. He fought me on that, finally brought one in. And the interpreter, did the interpretation. And I left. The interpreter and I were friends, but she told me that the expressions of that, she said, the doctor said, what do you do? Follow her everywhere to the grocery store? And like he was mocking me. So that sticks with me. But there's always professionals out there. You know, there are professionals that think that people that we're less than, and it happens. But at the same time, there are amazing professionals out there. Find one that values you and values your children. It is so worth it.
Yeah. And I like the idea of looking at the whole child, that perspective, whole child perspective. You know, and that it's not just a medical condition. Are there other questions? Family members who are deaf themselves, everyone needs to have free and easy access around each other. So it's important that, because we have those relationships with us the rest of our lives.
My husband's family can all hear. So in the beginning, it was tough because they didn't take turns. You know, if we went out as a family, I mean, I was lost and my husband was lost, but he was so used to it because that's what he grew up with. I mean, that was their thing. Now, my family was a different story because my mom is deaf. And my sister's deaf. And, you know, we understood turn taking. So it was easier to track the conversation. But my husband Joe's family, they had to be trained. And today, hey, props to them. When we go out as a family, they take turns, they summarize, they summarize. But it's very comfortable. But we had to train them in practice. I had to be direct with my communication with them and remind them, listen, I think it's been 32 years, so it's gotten a lot better, but don't wait that long with your family. You got to start that now.
Yes. And even if you're not using ASL yet, or you're not aware, still practice that eye contact. Get that eye contact, look at the person before you start speaking, tap them on the shoulder. Make sure that your deaf child is looking at you. That way it becomes habit. And you don't have to have ASL knowledge before you start practicing that part of it, of communication. All right, any more questions? Anybody want to open up their video? I mean, any questions about the importance of having a deaf role model? You know, but Karen, I really appreciate all of your stories about your children and your husband, your family.
Yeah, I'm an open book.
So there was a question, 2 questions from Connie.
Read the question. I applaud you for instilling a sense of identity in your children from the get-go and advise any advice you have for parents on that. And that's a great question. Again, I grew up without any hard of hearing identity. I hid it, to be honest with you. I mean, they gave me a hearing aid in 4th grade. I hated it. I hated the hearing aid. I shoved it in my pocket. And I did that for the whole summer, left it on the shelf. I hid who I was as a hard of hearing person. And I tried to become a hearing person. You know, I had to fake my way through many a conversation with a big smile and a nod of my head. All the while, the information was just going right over my head. So I did the, the social, yeah, I get you. I understand bluffing, the social bluffing. And there are many kids that do that. For example, if your child is the only deaf or hard of hearing child in the school or in the community, their measure of worth is with hearing people, because that's all that they have to measure with. If they can't get involved in a group conversation, they feel less than, and they measure themselves as less than. And it's simply because they can't perform like their hearing counterparts. So they feel less than. So there are two things parents can do. First of all, celebrate the beautiful deaf and hard of hearing identity from birth all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And become very comfortable with cute speech, with sign language, with spoken English, with the hearing aid, with the cochlear implant, with whatever it is. Celebrate it. Celebrate it. If you join Fostering Joy, it's specifically for parents. We'll send you that link, but celebrate. Okay, so there's that. At the same time, remember, I hammered my kids with their identity. I mean, we celebrated every chance we got, but still, they had an identity crisis, even with the best intentions and all the exposure and the role models and the this and the that. They still had to personally identify who they are, and they still went through a crisis. And all kids go through an identity crisis. They all do. It doesn't matter if you're deaf or hard of hearing. And the same concept goes for hearing kids. You got hearing kids fail, allow deaf kids to fail. But you have to have a level playing field when it comes to communication first. They can't be allowed to fail because of a lack of communication. When communication is on a level playing field, if a hearing kid fails, a deaf kid can fail too.
Mm-hmm.
As parents, it is our responsibility. 100% communication has to take place from day one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. I'm going to stick that in the recess. I'm going to remember that for a long time. All right, we have another question. And it says, let's see here, from Amina. She was asking, I'm wondering,
what kind of biases and assumptions do people have about the deaf community? Okay, so what was that related to that I said previously?
it was related to positive and negative experiences, I think, in the healthcare system.
Okay, so we face biases every day. And I don't want to use the word bias, actually. Assumptions, I think, is a better way to say it. Here's an example of that. When I started working at the horse farm, I'm a deaf person. And I walk in without much experience with horses at all. So the young people, hearing people, looked at me like, what gives with this girl? And the reason was I was deaf and couldn't communicate very easily. I made mistakes. And so that meant I was dumb in their eyes anyways, because we couldn't have a good conversation or a smooth conversation. So why bother? So those are the assumptions that happened at the very beginning. Now, I had to prove myself 10 times harder. I had to work. And they don't know that I've written 14 books. They don't know that I lost my hearing from water skiing. I can't put that on them. But they looked at me and thought, you're deaf, you can't. You must be less than we are. And it's a natural assumption people make, but I gave them time to get to know me and to, change how they thought. 99% of the time, most people will change how they think with knowledge and familiarity. So we have to work harder, yes, to prove ourselves. That's just what we do. But the world is not always kind to us. It's just a simple fact. But whether, deaf and hard of hearing people have to work 10 times harder. And when the world sees us that we can, then deaf gain and hard of hearing gain.
Yeah, that really supports the value of deafness and ASL. But how do we help people change their perspective or perception of deaf people and deafness?
Right. So looking back, I was rather lucky because the interpreter at the school had worked with the hearing kids to make my kid cool or popular. We needed her help and it worked. But many kids, had, respect for my kids. There wasn't a whole lot of bullying or teasing. And I think that was because of all the work that took place to make things, quote unquote, normal. And that has to happen for deaf and hard of hearing kids across the globe.
Okay, thank you. Oh, we have so many wonderful questions. Thank you, Amina. Now I want to focus on Sigo's question. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Sigo. I really appreciate how you put yourself out there, that you're aggressive with the school and in the community to set up events and welcome everyone. As a deaf mentor, I really appreciate how you've started that. And I want to know, how do I get started? How do I set up an event? Where do I start?
Yeah, that's a great question. Get involved with, well, first of all, where are the parents, for example? I went to a cochlear implant hospital and I would show up all the time to the meetings. Now, I don't have a cochlear implant, but the cochlear implant doctor was like, what gives? Because I was using sign language, and they were trying these parents into getting a cochlear implant. So then I show up to support the families. That's when the doctor was like, whoa, he had some respect for me at that point. Sometimes you have to earn your respect. I went to spoken language schools and volunteered. I went to cued speech meetings. I went to the cued speech conferences. I got involved everywhere I could. And I encourage professionals, if you're going in one direction, expand your horizon, expand your knowledge, because you're going to work with all kinds of families, deaf, hard of hearing, adults. And the more people you know, and the more knowledge you have, and the more experience you have, the more the families you work with are going to benefit.
That's wonderful.
Right, exactly. Yeah, just what Sigo said.
Yeah, getting out of your comfort zone. I see one comment from a parent. I was just looking at that. And I want to look at that before I transition to the professionals questions. It's a comment from Alex. He says that he has identical twin boys. They are 2.5 years old. One is deaf and the other is not. They decided on cochlear implants. They decided on bimodal, bilingual education. But everyone in the family is also learning ASL. And he says he's shocked of how many times he was told, don't use ASL, don't use sign language, raise your deaf child as if he is hearing. But our family is really trying to normalize deafness in our household, he said.
And I see that all the time. It's very common in our field, historically even. There are many children with cochlear implants, and I've worked with them in my time. And, you know, the results varies depending on the person. Of all the kids, I mean, their language is good. But some of the kids that I work with pick up American Sign Language and just, you know, but then they drop it and go with spoken English. Some start speaking and then they pick up sign language, but boy, I mean, it varies. If you give the children or your child an opportunity to use auditory AV equipment, audio sandwich, it's called an audio sandwich, which is speaking, signing, and speaking. Does that make sense for you guys? You sign sandwich, but you sign the word sandwich, speak the word sandwich, and sign the word sandwich. You have to use that with kids. And it's a great concept. So I'm trying to figure out how to explain this exactly, because there are so many kids with that need to use every communication mode possible, because the success is there no matter which communication mode you pick. But we're trying to narrow it down and make the kid pick one, and that's not how it works. There are 50,000 things involved in raising kids, and communication mode is just one of them. I mean, good night. There's all kinds of things. There's too many things to list. When you're raising children, so much is involved. So I look forward to the day when we can just put that all aside, and the arguing and the bickering and the at odds with each other, and just give families all the resources that are available. And so that's what I look forward to.
Yeah, that's the goal. That's our dream. Okay, I think I see one final comment from Tracy that just popped up. And she's talking about providing full access, full communication access, and that it's never too late. I mean, it's best to start early, but better late than never. And you want to make an informed choice. And you made the best choice you could at the time with the information that you had.
So my husband was born with 150 decibel hearing loss. So he's profoundly deaf, but he grew up with hearing aids, and he grew up with, home audio verbal therapy. I mean, his dad just made this up. They sit and listen to, the Cubs game, and he could understand. Now he's deaf. I mean, he's profoundly deaf. But he would use the phone. I can't use the phone personally. So what is on the audiogram is not indicative of success or failure or possibilities or abilities. It doesn't tell you what your child's going to do. An audiogram is a test. That's it. So my husband with 105, not a 150, 105 decibel hearing loss. I mean, he was like, I think my hearing aid's broken. And I was like, what? So we swapped him out. And he still couldn't hear anything at all. So my deaf husband actually became deaf 5 years ago. Now, you know, he got a cochlear implant and he took it, you know, I mean, and he uses it for everything. And they tell us, you know, oh, you know, if you do this, it's going to be too late and all, you know, but you know what? Start where you are right now. Take baby steps, one step at a time. Deaf and hard of hearing people are inviting you into their life and into their world. So take the opportunity.
That is a beautiful picture to wrap up with, because we're getting to the end of our time together tonight. Wow. There's so many questions now in the chat comment, but thank you to our audience for your participation. And thank you to Karen for sharing your story and being open, being vulnerable enough to show us what your life journey has been like. And so that we can model that as well.
Well, thanks for having me.
Do you have any final words that you would like to share with us before we wrap it up?
Well, I actually have a story to wrap up, just one.
All right, come on.
How many of you know the name Cal Rogers? Anybody? Any hands in the air? Nobody? No responses in the chat? Okay, well, I guess it's safe to say you don't know who Cal Rogers is. Well, way back in 1911, Cal flew from New York to Los Angeles. Okay.
In 1911?
Oh, yeah. Can you even imagine? Open air airplane. I mean, so yeah. Woo. He landed in LA. The first plane trip, the first pilot
To successfully
first
fly that.
deaf pilot. Okay, it was the first first pilot ever, hearing or
Ever.
deaf. Thank you for the clarification for the interpreter. So Cal just happened to be a deaf guy. So imagine flying from New York to LA as a, okay, and you know, hey, that's great. But it's an open air airplane.
Ooh,
A
noise.
hearing pilot couldn't hear anything because of the noise, but a deaf person could, because deaf it was called deaf gain. It's called deaf gain. And so that's just one point. Now, my husband and I, we went to Washington, D.C. and it was an air and space museum. And wouldn't you know it, Cal Rogers' airplane is hanging from the ceiling in that museum. I was so excited. It was a full thing of Cal Rogers. There was his story. Of course, I had to read every single line of it. But you know what? Never said a word about him being deaf. And here is this man in history, in the Space and Air Museum, and not a single word that he was a deaf person. At first, I was livid. I'm thinking, come on, shouldn't there be something in the story that said he was deaf? This is a travesty that they've neglected to mention this. But once I calmed down and I got to thinking about it, I thought, okay, Okay, so what? He's deaf. It's just another day, just another life. It's just another job. It's just another do what he was doing. So what? He's deaf. So that's the message. But there is another message. There are millions and billions of people that miss the fact that a deaf person made history. So, two different perspectives about the same exact situation. And you can look at it either way. A deaf person can make a difference in this world. And maybe your child will be the next one.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's a very powerful story. All right, if anyone wants to open up their video screen to say goodbye, then please do. Thank you so much, Karen. We appreciate it. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good night. Good night. Take care.